Hi everyone, welcome to the Coding Channel. Today is the 25th episode of our Java programming tutorial series. And in this episode, we are going to talk about value returning methods in Java. This and more when we come back. This is now the part 2 of our Java method tutorial. If you haven't watched our previous episode, that is the 24th episode, we already talked about methods, specifically the void, static, and the non-static methods. Today, we are going to talk about the value returning method. Now, when we talk about value returning method, it is a method having return data type other than void, which uses a return keyword, and it is required to return a value when it is called. Now, for example, we want to create a static method that will return an integer variable. So we can just have a static and then int, and then for example, we have get random number. Okay, now our plan for this method is just to generate random numbers from 1 to 10, for example. How are we going to do that? By using the random class. So we will, for example, create an object first of a random class that random is equal to random. And then take note that we already import the random class. And then we can use now the random method, random dot next int, for example. And since we want to have random numbers from 1 to 10, so we can just specify here 10. And then, for example, it starts from 0, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's 10 numbers starting from 0 to 9 as a single digit number. Okay, and since we have now the int here, we are required to return. Okay, if we are going to run this one without using the return statement, since it is written here that it is required to return a value when called if it is a value returning method, meaning other than void, because the last time in our previous episode we used only void keyword here. Now if you put an int here or any data type other than void, that's only means that it's a value returning method and it's required to return a value. In this example, we are required to return an integer value using the return keyword. So how are we going to do that? So we can just specify here using return space and then random dot next int. Okay, that's simple it is. So return a single digit. Now, how are we going to call this method the get a random number? For instance, we have we can actually assign it using the get random number. Get random number. Okay, so that's it. We have the method call. This is an example of a method call. Okay, it should match with the parameter if there's any. In this example, we don't have any parameter here. Okay, so meaning we don't expect any value coming from the one who will call this method, which they get random number, but we are expected to return a value, that is by using the return keyword. So the value of digit now is a random number from 0 to 9. Okay, so for instance, we want to just copy this one and have another number, for example, digit 1 and then digit 2. So we can reuse again the get random number. That is the advantage of having a separate method that generates a random number. Okay, and then if you try to, for example, to run this one, you can just have use a system.out that println, for example, for us to try this one. Let's say we have digit 1 plus digit 2. Let's just put a space in between, and then okay, that's it. If you're going to run this, and then here we go. So we have now the random 2 and a 6. If you're going to run again, it will generate another random number from 0 to 9 and then another 0 to 9. So that's the advantage of using that. Okay, another example. What if we want to have a method that returns also an integer value, and then it only adds two numbers? Okay, so meaning this time we have a parameters. So for example, we have a number 1 and int number 2. Okay, so what is the difference of this second example of our method heading? Okay, both are required to return an integer value, but this time this one has a parameter. And again, we call this as a formal parameter. We have a local variable that whenever we use this method, we are required to pass two values uh, to this method. Okay, and then what's the functionality, for example, of this method? If you would just want to add two numbers, so you can just specify here return and then number 1 plus number 2 and then a semicolon. So that's it. Now if we are going, for example, to test that one, just copy this one, Control C. We want to display the output. Okay, you just have to specify the method name, and then we need to pass the two values. For example, the digit 1 plus I'm sorry, digit 1 and then digit 2. Okay, the result of our random, for example. Okay, so let's try. For example, now the result is 1 and 0. So 1 plus 0 is 1. So that's how we do it. Okay, now aside, so I'm showing you now the two versions if we are calling a method that is a value returning method. Either you assign, okay, you assign. This one is an example of after you call that method, since this method returns a value, okay, what are you going to do with the return a value? So in here, this is an example of an assignment statement. So we assign, and then before we print. Or the second example, I'm showing you now the other way that you can directly print the return a value. So when the Java execute the statement, before printing, the program execution stops here at main and then jump at line number 23, for example, to call the add method and pass the value of digit 1 and digit 2. So the number 1 will have now the value of digit 1, and the number 2 will take the value of digit 2, and then it will add the two numbers and then return the sum. Then after the value has been returned here, that's the only time that Java will now execute the output statement and display now the result. That's why we have now the result here. If we are going to run this one again, so we have 3 and 9, so 9 plus 3 is 12. That's how we do it. Another example, for example now, let's try a method that returns a string value. For example, we have a static, a string, and then a get question. But this time, for us to formulate the question, we will be needing two values that will be coming from the one who will call this method. For example, we have number 1 and then we have number 2. Okay. And then, what are we going to do? It's either we assign here or directly we can use the return statement. Okay, for example, the return string is how much is what? Is the value, for example, of number 1 plus, we can just specify here, for example, plus, and then number 2 plus, for example, we have a question mark there. You just have to put a plus here and then the question mark, and then that's it, and then we have a semicolon. So this is an example now of a string return a value, which is a string, because we have a string a variable here. Even if number 1 and number 2 is an integer variable, we all know that when we concatenate it with the string, so this whole statement now is a string value. Okay, if in the event that for instance I want to comment this one, and then for example we return number 1, and we all know that number 1 is an integer variable. Okay, if you are going to run this one, we will encounter, okay, in this example we are actually running the last one. Okay, let's try to have another. Let's clear this one. You're going to run this. Okay, if you have noticed, we still have the output. Okay, it's because we did not use the get question on in here. Okay, but we have an error here actually. Okay, and what is the error? Okay, the type mismatch cannot convert from int to string. Okay, because once you specify a string here, Java expects a string return value. Okay, now for example we are going to use that one, the get question. Okay, so let's try to have an output statement here, for example, and we want to display that output. So we have a get question. Okay, so get question, then run. Okay, so if you have noticed now, since inside the main method, we call this method, okay, our first error is the number of parameters. Okay, because when we call the get question, okay, you have to include the parentheses. Plus, okay, let's try to run this again for you to know. Okay, and result comparison problem. The method get question has int in the type math quiz game. Okay, for example, because this one has no parameters and the get question has two parameters, so we are required to pass two values to the get a question method. So the number of parameters should match. Okay, that's why we have an error. Okay, so for example, we want to pass the digit 1 and then a digit 2 in our get question. Okay, the we have now the get question method name, that is correct, and we pass now the two values, which is also an integer variable, that is correct. Okay, but we also have, we still get an error here. It's because our return type does not match with the return statement done here, because number 1 is an integer um, variable. Okay, and we will encounter this type of error, the type mismatch cannot convert from int to string. Okay, so that's why we have to follow that. If we the main reason why you declare that, okay, just to let the Java that you are about to return a string value. Okay, so let's try to have this one. We have now 7, 5. The result of this digit 1 and digit 2. Okay, and then 7 plus 5 is 12, and then how much is 7 plus 5? So there you go now. Okay, next. Now, what if we want to have a method that simply get the user input? So let's say, for example, we have a static, and then the return type is int, and then get user input, and then we'll take nothing, for example, from the calling method. Okay, so what's the functionality of the get user input? This one will just read the value, okay, coming from the user using a console, for example. Since we are reading or getting the user input from the console, we will be using the scanner class here. And then, for example, we have scan is equal to a scanner, and then we have a system dot in. Okay, and then we will just make sure that we already have import the scanner class. Okay, And then how are we going to read the user input? Okay, we have scan. We will use the object name scan dot. For example, we are reading an integer, so next in. Okay, and then we will return scan dot next in. Okay, or um, you can actually, if you don't want to use the return statement here directly, you can actually assign it first to for example a variable, for example a num is equal to scan next int, and then you use a return a statement here, return num. So that is also possible. But of course, the shortcut way is to use the return statement instead of having an additional variable here. Okay, so I just want you to show that one. Okay, but we'll just use this one. Okay, so let's try to use the get user input. How are we going to use that? Okay, for example, we have the get user input here. Once you call the get user input, we are required to return um, the value. So it's either we assign. Okay, for example, we have int user input is equal to get user input. Get user input with no argument. Okay, so that's it. That's how we call this method without argument. So without argument, and then it will return. For example, the user have entered 5. So the value of user input here is 5. Now, if you are going to display, okay, let's have another output statement here. So system.out.print, for example, let's try to display the user input. Okay, so let's try to run again. The output, we have a 0, 8, okay, generated by this first output statement. And then we have now 8 because of this add. And then how much is 0 plus 8? So for example, the user have entered a 0 plus 8, and then we have 8, for example. Once you press the enter key, okay, it will just display the what you have entered. And we've entered 8, so that's why the result here is 8. So far so good. We have the get user input, get question, the add, and then the get random. Okay, for example, let's try another. We want to have a method that will display, I mean return a string value, and then for example we just want to have a get a correct response, and to have a get correct response. Okay, so we will use this method if we want to have a response. You want to, let's say if it's a correct, so we will return the string correct. Okay, as simple as that. And another, if we want to have a method that would display, for example, a wrong response or incorrect response, you can have incorrect response, and then for example wrong. Okay, so that's it. And then what else? What if we have a Boolean return a value? So for example, we have Boolean. Okay, for example, answer checker. The answer checker, and then we have we're just going to compare two values. For example, we have the user input, for example, and then the correct value. I'm sorry, you have the correct value. Okay, now we are required to return a boolean, so we have return, for example. Okay, return, and then we can just put here using the ternary operator that I've already discussed this in our previous episode. For example, if the value of input and correct is are equal, okay, so um, the result is true, otherwise it's false, then semicolon. So that's how we create a method answer checker that accepts two integer values and then return a boolean. It's either true or false. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. How many methods do we have now? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Okay, so let us now try to use these methods to generate random numbers. Okay, let me run this one. Okay, this is the expected output now. For example, how much is 10 plus 5? So we have, for example, 15. So correct. How much is 8 plus 1? Okay, we have, for example, 7. Wrong. How much is 5 plus 5? So for example, 10. Then correct. And the total score is 2 over 3. So this is our expected output now. So how are we going to uh, modify or call or use these methods for us to generate this output? It's like having three input statements asking us to answer the addition problem. Okay, let's try. So we have now, let's try to have this. How much is 10 plus 5 by using this? Okay, so if you have noticed that we have created a method, so we divide the task. Okay, so it's like having divide and conquer. Okay, we divide a task so that each method here has a unique task. Say for example, if you just want to add two numbers, so you just have to call this one, and we can reuse this actually in another class in the near future. Okay, if you only want to generate random numbers, for example, so we can just reuse this one. That's the advantage of using a method. Or every time that you want to display a response for correct answer, so you will just call this method get correct or get incorrect. Okay, so let's try. Okay, so we will modify now the uh, main method. What's inside of our main method? Okay, so first we have now the random number digit 1 and digit 2, and then we need to display the output. Okay, the question. Okay, how are we going to do that? So we have a get question that actually display us. Okay, so we can just use this one. We will display it here. So system dot out dot print. For example, we will call the get question now. We have get question. Okay, and then we will pass the digit 1. Okay, and then the digit 2. So that's it. Digit 1 and digit 2 to get a question. Okay, so if we're going to run this one now, okay, how much is 8 plus 9? 9, 17, for example. Okay, so we cannot enter the 17 because we did not call the get user input to get the user input. Okay, so the next step is to call now or use this get user input without argument and expected to return an integer. Okay, so get user input. Get user input. Okay, common programming error. Normally, okay, you specify the get user input. So we have a get user input. Okay, once you run, it's syntactically correct, but logically incorrect. Why? Because yes, we call the get user input, but the get user input is returning a value after getting the user input. Okay, so return num, so meaning if the user have entered a 5, so we have now a 5 here. The value of get user input now is 5, but we did nothing. Okay, so as I told you before, if you are calling a value returning method, it's either you assign after you call that method, so you assign the return value to let's say an integer variable, or you display. So that's the two most commonly used method on how to catch the return value. So in this case, since the get user input is not a void method, it's a value returning method that returns an integer, we are going to decide now what to do. Okay, if the user have entered the, for example, 5 as the answer, what are we going to do? Okay, so the best way is to assign it to a, for example, we have a user input. The user input variable is equal to get a user input. Okay, and then what's next after the user have entered the answer? Okay, so we will now check if the user input, okay, and then but before we compare, okay, we need to call the um the what we need to call the add method. Okay, take note for us to know the correct answer. So for example, we have int correct. Okay, we'll add here int correct answer. Okay, incorrect answer is equal to, we will call the add method, add, and then we will pass digit 1 comma digit 2. Okay, so we pass the digit 1 to digit 2 to add, and then it will the add method will return now the sum of digit 1 and digit 2, and we store it to the correct answer. Okay, and then we display the question, the user, we call the get user input to read the user input, and then once returned, we assign it to user input variable. So we can now compare this two. Okay, how are we going to compare? And we have created a method that compare if it's equal, or if it is true or not. No, if the value of input is equal to the correct answer, for example. So we are going now to pass the correct answer and the user input to the answer checker that we have created. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Okay, so we specify the answer checker method name. Okay, and then we will pass the what? The first is the input, the user input, and then the correct answer. So we have the user input, we will pass it user input, comma, and then the correct answer. Okay, so after we pass this one, the correct answer, we will assign this to a Boolean variable. For example, is correct. Okay, so let's try it. Try again. Answer checker, we pass the user input and the correct answer. Okay, so what the answer checker is doing here is that after getting the input and the correct, compare. If it is equal, that means to say the answer of the user is correct, so we will return true. So the value of is correct variable here is either true or false. True if correct, false if incorrect. Okay, and then we will display the what? For example, how much is 5 plus 2? So 7. The user have entered 7. And then we will, after when the user have entered the enter key, we will generate the response, either correct or incorrect. So we will use the output statement system.out that print ln, for example. Okay. So In here, we are going to determine if the value of is correct. For example, is a true, so we will call the get a correct response to display to return as the correct string. So we will use this one, get correct response. I'm using the ternary operator again here, okay, and then incorrect response if it is false. Incorrect response. Okay, so incorrect response, and then we have get incorrect response. Get incorrect response. It's correct. Get correct response. Get incorrect response. Okay, that's it. Let's try to run this one. Try to run. Okay, how much is 4 plus 3? So 4 plus 3 is 7. Once you press the enter key, that is correct. Okay, so next, how much is 3 plus 7 again? For example, 10. Correct. Again, let's try. How much is 1 plus 3? For example, 3. So that is wrong. Okay. Now, if we are going to repeat this, for example, 3 times, okay, so we can just put this one inside of the for loop. For example, for int I is equal to 0, and then I less than, for example, 3, and then I plus plus. Then you will just put this one inside of our for loop. Okay, that's it. And then let's try to have a separate variable here. For example, we have max max value. Let's say we have 3, so that anytime that we want to increase the number of questions, so we can just simply modify the value of max there. Okay, and then so what's next? We need to know every time the user have entered the correct answer. Okay, we need to tally, of course, the result. Okay, if the user have entered 3 correct answer, for example, so we will display total is 3 over 3. Okay, something like that. Okay, so how do we know that if the user have entered the correct answer? So every time we call the get correct response here, for example, before we return the correct answer, so meaning the user have entered the correct answer, so we will have a counter variable here, so that every time that we call this one, we'll add 1 to the variable. Since we are using the static method, so it's about time to have to declare outside here, okay, a static variable. For example, int and then counter. Okay, why I put this one outside of main method? Okay, so that if there is a changes here, okay, inside of the main method, and if there is also a changes when it comes to the value of that counter inside of the correct response, okay, this one will be updated. Okay, so you will just have to put here counter a plus plus, for example, and then that is correct. And then how are we going to compute that one? Okay, we will just put here outside of our for loop the output statement, the total system.out that print ln, for example, total is, and then a plus counter, okay, plus counter over let's say over max. That's it, and then semicolon. So let's try run, and then how much is 8 plus 2? 8, 9, 10. 10. Correct. How much is 1 plus 3? For example, 3. Wrong, because the answer is 4. How much is 1 plus 8? 9. Okay, correct. So the total is 2 over 3. Okay, so there you go. That's how simple it is on how to um, divide the task by using a method. As you can see, the main method here act as a program controller only. Just to call, okay, if you want to have a random number, you just have to call this one. And later, if you're going to create another class, we can reuse all these methods. So this is how we use the value returning method. If you have a question, don't hesitate to comment down below in our comment section, so that I can also help you if there is a part of this episode that you don't really understand. And I appreciate your comment. So that's all the source code for this episode. And that's all for today. And if you like this video, please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And as always, show your love through comments and favorites. God bless and thank you for watching.